It began without urgency, and that absence was noted more than once. The earliest document that mentions the day, October 3rd, 1907, is a routine entry in the county weather register. The clerk's hand is steady, the ink unbroken, clear, mild, river level normal for season. There are no marginal marks, no later corrections. The record does not know yet that it will be reread. In the same ledger, several pages later, a second hand has underlined the date in blue pencil. That underline was added months afterward, when the volume was retrieved from storage and examined page by page. The underline is the first act of hindsight. On that morning, however, the day presented itself as generous. Dawn arrived gradually over Glenrowan, a small river town accustomed to patience. The mills did not begin work until full light. The church bell rang at its usual hour. Nothing in the rhythm of the town suggested compression or threat. The four men left separately and met at the eastern landing, just downstream from the bend where the Allegheny narrows and then opens again. No one recorded the exact minute of departure. That detail did not seem important at the time. Elijah Moore arrived first. He was known locally as deliberate, a man who disliked being hurried and disliked even more the appearance of haste. His coat was buttoned carefully, his hat brushed clean. According to his wife's later recollection, he paused in the doorway that morning, not as if reconsidering the trip, but as if measuring whether he had forgotten anything. He had not. Thomas Klein followed shortly after. Klein kept fewer records than Moore, but his account books show no irregularities in the days surrounding the journey. Payments were logged in advance. Obligations were deferred without comment. This too suggests expectation of return. Arthur Bell arrived last, slightly out of breath, apologetic more from habit than necessity. He carried a new field notebook, its pages still stiff. Bell was younger than the others and inclined toward precision. He wrote things down not because he feared forgetting them, but because he believed written order reflected natural order. The notebook would later become the most cited artifact in the case. Samuel Reed was already at the water's edge. As ferryman, he had no reason to arrive ceremonially. He was present because he always was. Reed's familiarity with the river was not the sort that invites commentary. It was assumed, and therefore rarely discussed. They spoke briefly. Witnesses recall nothing unusual in the exchange. The words time, schedule, and delay appear in no contemporaneous account of that morning. If those concepts were considered, they remained internal. The boat was loaded methodically. Provisions first, then instruments. The men checked the fittings, not because they expected trouble, but because checking was routine. Routine is the enemy of alarm. When they pushed off, the river accepted them easily. The current was cooperative, the surface broken only by scattered leaves already turning color. Reed adjusted the rudder with minimal effort. No one commented on speed. At approximately 9 o'clock, they passed the first mile marker. Bell noted it precisely. Moore estimated it as early morning. These differences matter only because later readers will attempt to synchronize them. At the time, both descriptions were sufficient. The purpose of the journey was not urgent. Boundary verification could be completed before winter, but not necessarily that day. There was no deadline imposed by law or contract. Moore had written 2 days earlier, "We can take the time to do it properly." The sentence appears in a letter to the timber company, preserved because it later seemed ironic. At the time, it was unremarkable. The illusion of time does not present itself as abundance. It presents itself as adequacy. 10 miles upriver, near a gravel bank seldom used but well known, the river widens briefly before narrowing again. This location appears in Reed's earlier route notes, though not in Bell's newly drafted maps. It was not part of their plan, but it existed as an option. From there, a narrow path led inland, connecting eventually with the old coach road back to Glenrowan. Bell sketched the bend casually as they approached, more for completeness than necessity. Beneath the sketch, he wrote, "Water level stable, bank accessible." The phrase bank accessible would later be read as possibility. They slowed slightly as Reed guided the boat closer to shore, not to dock, only to avoid a shallow. Moore stood and looked briefly at the bank. According to Bell's account, he said nothing. Klein adjusted one of the cases to keep it from shifting. There is no record of discussion at that point, no recorded vote, no expressed doubt. The boat did not stop because stopping was not required. The men believed themselves to be within a wide margin of safety. That belief was not careless. It was based on experience, repetition, and the absence of contradiction. The river had not yet contradicted them. They continued. As the morning progressed, the river changed almost imperceptibly. The current strengthened, but not abruptly. Reed compensated without remark. Bell noted the adjustment in his notebook, not as warning but as observation. Flow marginally increased, he wrote. The word marginally carries no urgency. Shortly before noon, they passed a second informal landing, less distinct than the first. It was used primarily by trappers and not marked on any official chart. Reed knew it existed. He did not point it out. There was no reason to. Nothing compelled choice. They ate midday in the boat, drifting slowly while Reed maintained position against the current. Bell recorded the time. Moore did not. Klein, according to later testimony, remarked that they were making good progress. The phrase appears in his brother's affidavit, given months later. It reflects not measurement, but impression. At this point, the illusion of time was complete. They had passed opportunities without acknowledging them as such. Each unmade decision reinforced the belief that decisions could be made later, under clearer conditions. The historian examining these moments must be careful not to assign weight retroactively. No alarm bell was ignored. No obvious sign was dismissed. The tragedy, if it can be called that at this stage, was procedural, rather than dramatic. After lunch, Bell asked about the narrowing channel ahead. Reed answered honestly, it would require attention, but it was passable. He had done it before. Moore nodded. Klein said nothing. Silence in this context signaled agreement. They resumed upriver travel at approximately 1 o'clock. The light shifted subtly, lengthening shadows along the bank. Reed adjusted course again, slightly more frequently now. Bell's handwriting remains neat, but his notes grow shorter. He was recording less, not because more was happening, but because he was accustomed to what was happening. At 2:15, Bell made an entry that has since been quoted extensively. Could have turned back earlier. No need. The phrase is ambiguous. Some interpret it as foresight. Others see it as idle notation. It was written lightly, without emphasis, and followed immediately by a sketch of tree cover along the bend. The important detail is not the content of the note, but its tone. It does not urge action. It does not suggest regret. It merely acknowledges possibility. They had, by then, passed the last clearly accessible landing. No one marked that moment as final. No one announced it. It existed only as geography, not as decision. The river continued to accept them. The final document from that day that can be dated with confidence is a brief line in Bell's notebook, written just before 3 o'clock. Proceeding as planned. Turning back possible, but unnecessary. It is the last recorded acknowledgement that another choice still existed. The absence of urgency did not come from ignorance. It came from familiarity. The men had spent years moving through environments that demanded patience rather than speed. Surveying, especially along rivers, rewarded steadiness. Progress was rarely linear. One learned to wait for light, for water, for conditions to settle. Impatience was associated with mistakes, not efficiency. In the archival material, this mindset appears repeatedly, though never stated outright. It emerges through tone, through phrasing, through what is not emphasized. Moore's earlier reports describe delays as neutral facts, not inconveniences. Held position until fog lifted. Remained overnight due to poor footing. These entries are unadorned. Delay was not failure. Delay was procedure. Klein's correspondence shows the same pattern. When schedules slipped, explanations were brief. He did not justify pauses because they required no justification. The work existed on the river's terms, not the calendar's. Bell, though younger and trained more formally, adopted this rhythm quickly. His notebook from earlier assignments shows long stretches of sparse entries punctuated by precise measurements. He wrote when something changed. On October 3rd, nothing appeared to change decisively. Reed's perspective, reconstructed later through testimony, adds another layer. As ferryman, he understood danger not as a single event, but as accumulation. A river did not become dangerous because of one condition, but because of several converging factors. On that day, those factors had not yet aligned clearly. The river rose gradually. This mattered. A sudden surge would have commanded attention. A gradual rise blended into expectation. Seasonal increases were normal. Reed had seen them dozens of times. He later stated, "If it had jumped, I'd have said something." It didn't. What he did notice, according to his account, was effort. The rudder required more correction. The boat responded slightly slower. These were not warnings so much as adjustments. He made them without comment because commenting would have suggested abnormality. The men trusted Reed's silence. Silence in this context functioned as reassurance. Reed was not known to withhold concerns. If he had one, he would speak. That he did not speak implied that conditions remained within acceptable bounds. The historian must pause here to consider how groups interpret non-action. Silence is rarely neutral. In structured environments, it often signals approval. Moore, as the informal leader, bore responsibility for decisions, but he relied on shared expertise. Reed understood the river. Bell understood measurement. Klein understood logistics. Moore synthesized. None of them felt compelled to challenge the others because nothing violated expectations strongly enough to demand challenge. At mid-afternoon, the narrowing channel approached. Bell had asked about it earlier, not with anxiety, but with procedural curiosity. Reed's response, manageable, was sufficient. The word appears repeatedly in later reconstructions, though not always attributed to Reed directly. It became a summary of the day's attitude. The channel itself did not present as hostile. The banks closed in gradually. The current tightened but remained orderly. There was no turbulence, no audible change. The water moved faster, but smoothly. Bell noted the narrowing with care. His sketch becomes more detailed here, as if complexity itself warranted documentation. Still, his language remains calm. Channel reduced, navigation steady. At this point, some later analysts suggest that urgency should have been felt. They point to charts, to subsequent water level data, to weather patterns that became relevant only later. These analyses impose coherence that the men did not possess. They did not know what would happen. They knew only what had happened before. What had happened before was manageable. The daily rhythm reinforced this belief. Afternoon was still early by river standards. They had daylight. They had provisions. They had options, or so they believed. No single factor suggested imminent loss of those options. Bell's timekeeping contributes to this illusion. He recorded hours with precision, but not urgency. Time, to him, was a coordinate, not a resource to be conserved. His entries mark passage, not pressure. Moore, who did not keep such precise time, relied instead on light. According to Reed, Moore remarked once that afternoon that they had plenty of daylight left. The phrase appears in Reed's testimony, though Reed could not recall the exact moment it was said. That imprecision itself is telling. The remark did not stand out. Klein's silence is perhaps the most revealing. He was known among colleagues as cautious. If he had felt concern, it likely would have surfaced indirectly, in suggestion, in question, in adjustment of plan. No such trace appears in the record. His later statements express regret, but not alarm. At the time, it felt ordinary. He is reported to have said before his own death years later, "Ordinary conditions rarely provoke decisive action." The men's shared assumption was that the river would announce danger clearly, that it would cross a line, behave differently, demand response. Until then, proceeding was rational. This assumption is not irrational. It is learned. Rivers often do announce themselves, through noise, through turbulence, through visible obstruction. This river did not. Instead, It required interpretation. Interpretation requires attention. Attention competes with routine. The illusion of time was reinforced by continuity. Each minute resembled the last closely enough to suggest stability. Each adjustment made by Reed confirmed that control remained possible. Each note written by Bell confirmed that observation continued. There was no moment that felt like a mistake. When they passed the less distinct landing, used by trappers, unmarked, easy to miss, it did not register as a choice. Reed noticed it. He later acknowledged that. But noticing is not the same as evaluating. It was not on their plan. Plans exert gravity. The historian reviewing the sequence must acknowledge how plans constrain perception. Deviating from a plan requires justification. Continuing does not. On October 3rd, no justification for deviation presented itself strongly enough. By the time the channel narrowed fully, effort increased again. Reed compensated. Bell noted. Moore watched. Klein adjusted equipment. Each action reinforced the sense that the situation was under control. Control in this sense was not absolute. It was sufficient. Urgency arises when sufficiency collapses suddenly. Here, sufficiency eroded quietly. The men did not feel urgency because urgency had not yet been named. It had no form, no signal, no sound. It existed only as a future possibility, indistinct and therefore ignorable. They believed there would be time to respond when response became necessary. The historian reading backward knows that belief was false, but at the moment it was held. It was reasonable. That is what makes the delay so durable and so dangerous. The moment did not announce itself. There was no clear boundary between safety and danger, no audible change in the river's voice, no visible marker that would later be circled on a map and labeled decisive. The passage from margin to constraint occurred by degrees, and because it occurred by degrees, it did not compel attention. Bell's notebook provides the most continuous account of the afternoon. The pages covering the hours between 3 and 4 o'clock show a subtle shift, not in content, but in density. Measurements continue, observations persist. What disappears is commentary. Earlier entries include qualifying phrases, slightly, marginally, still. Now the notes become factual to the point of austerity. Channel narrower, current faster, boat responding slower. These are not alarms, they are acknowledgements. The narrowing channel did not feel like a trap. It felt like a technical section of the route. Reed had navigated similar passages before, though perhaps not under these exact conditions. Experience does not always differentiate between similar and identical. At approximately 3:20, Reed adjusted the rudder more sharply than before. The movement was routine enough that no one commented on it. Moore shifted his stance to maintain balance. Klein secured one of the cases more firmly. These actions were automatic, unremarkable. What matters is not that they occurred, but that they occurred without discussion. Discussion would have marked a transition from observation to evaluation. Evaluation would have required a question. Should we continue? No one asked it because asking it would have implied doubt. Doubt, in the absence of clear danger, felt unnecessary. Bell's final complete sentence appears here. Return would take longer now. It is written without emphasis, aligned neatly with the margin. The sentence does not propose action. It merely updates a condition. The historian must linger on this phrasing. Would take longer is not the same as might be impossible. It implies inconvenience, not urgency. It frames the situation as one of efficiency rather than risk. Moore likely read the river differently. He did not rely on time or measurement, but on continuity. According to Reed's recollection, Moore watched the banks closely, gauging distance and slope. He later told investigators that Moore appeared calm, attentive. Calmness in leadership reassures others. At 3:30, the light shifted again. The sun dipped behind a line of trees on the western bank, altering reflections on the water. Reed compensated instinctively. Bell noted the change in light, not because it affected navigation, but because it affected visibility for measurement. The river at this point required commitment. The current no longer allowed drifting pauses. Forward motion became continuous, not forced but expected. Stopping would have required deliberate effort. This is often where later narratives insert a dramatic pause. They imagine a moment when someone suggests stopping, when voices lower, when time seems to stretch. The record offers no support for this. What likely occurred was far quieter. Reed noticed that turning the boat against the current would require coordination. Not impossible, but awkward. He considered mentioning it. The thought passed. He assumed Moore was already aware. Moore, watching Reed's adjustments, assumed that if turning back became necessary, Reed would indicate as much. This mutual assumption, each waiting for the other to speak, created a vacuum where decision might have occurred. Bell, whose role did not include navigation authority, noticed the increased effort but did not interpret it as a signal to intervene. His training emphasized documentation, not command. He wrote what he saw. Klein, whose responsibility was logistical rather than directional, focused on securing equipment and maintaining balance. His attention was occupied. He trusted Moore. No one acted because no one felt authorized to interrupt the flow. The last opportunity to turn back without significant difficulty passed at approximately 3:45. This estimate is derived from later analysis of current speed and the location where recovered debris was found weeks later. At the time, no one marked it. There was no marker to mark. Bell's notebook ends abruptly. The final entry is incomplete, a partial line. Water. The dash suggests interruption, but not necessarily alarm. It could indicate distraction, a momentary need to steady himself, or simply the decision to stop writing because writing was no longer practical. There is no evidence that panic followed, no torn pages, no erratic handwriting. The notebook was found closed, its pencil tucked inside. What followed must be inferred. The river beyond the narrowing channel curves sharply and deepens. The banks become steeper, limiting access. Under rising water conditions, eddies form near the inner bend. These features are well documented in later surveys. If the boat entered this section with reduced maneuverability, options would have diminished further. Not abruptly, but cumulatively. The historian must resist speculation beyond the evidence. What can be stated with confidence is that by the time any of the men recognized that return was no longer feasible, feasibility had already eroded. Recognition lagged reality. This lag is the core of the disappearance. Not ignorance, not recklessness, but delay in aligning perception with condition. There is no record of raised voices, no account of argument. The men were not overwhelmed by sudden danger. They were constrained by gradual change. By the time action became necessary, it was no longer simple. The moment that slipped away did so without ceremony. It did not feel like a moment at all. It felt like continuation. And continuation in that context was indistinguishable from safety. The absence was not immediately alarming. When the men did not return on the evening of October 3rd, no signal was raised. Glenrowan was accustomed to irregular schedules. Work upriver often extended unexpectedly. Camps were established as needed. Moore had done so before. Klein had done so before. Even Bell, despite his precision, had written in earlier notebooks about nights spent unexpectedly along the bank due to fading light. The first night passed without comment. On the morning of October 4th, Moore's wife mentioned the delay to a neighbor. The neighbor replied that the river had been rising and that the men were likely waiting for better conditions. The remark was not reassuring so much as explanatory. It placed the delay within familiar boundaries. The second night introduced mild concern, but not urgency. By then the river had risen further following rainfall upstream. Ferry traffic was temporarily reduced. Reed, questioned informally by townspeople, stated that if the men had camped upriver, they would likely wait until levels stabilized. His words, later repeated in affidavits, were measured. There's no cause yet. On October 5th, when the men still had not returned, Moore's wife visited the sheriff's office. Her statement, preserved in a thin folder labeled simply Moore et al., does not accuse or demand. It requests inquiry. They may be delayed longer than expected, she says. The conditional phrasing mirrors the mindset that had accompanied the men upriver. Search efforts began that afternoon, modest in scope. 2 deputies accompanied by local volunteers walked sections of the lower bank. They found nothing unusual, no fire remnants, no discarded equipment. The river, swollen but orderly, gave no sign of disruption. It was not until October 7th that the search expanded meaningfully. By then, the river had changed character. What had been manageable current became persistent force. Access points disappeared beneath water. Paths that once led easily inland were submerged or eroded. The first physical evidence emerged on October 9th. A measuring rod lodged against a fallen tree approximately 6 miles downstream from the narrowing channel. It bore no damage beyond what water might cause. The rod did not suggest violence or struggle. It suggested abandonment. This detail shaped the investigation's tone. If the men had been attacked or overwhelmed suddenly, evidence would likely show it. Instead, objects appeared as if released gradually, one by one. Over the following weeks, more items surfaced. A canvas satchel, bearing Bell's initials, recovered intact but waterlogged. A section of rope, frayed at one end, found caught on a submerged root. None of these items pointed to a single catastrophic moment. Investigators documented each find meticulously. Their reports, written in careful script, avoid speculation. Item recovered consistent with prolonged exposure. No marks indicating external force. The boat was never found. This absence frustrated efforts to reconstruct events definitively. Without the boat, the precise sequence remained inaccessible. Investigators turned instead to probability. They mapped the river's behavior under similar conditions. They interviewed Reed extensively. They examined Bell's notebook until its pages softened from handling. They reread Moore's letters, Klein's ledgers, even minor receipts found among their effects. What emerged was not a story of error, but of timing. The consensus, stated cautiously in the final report, was that the men had proceeded beyond a point where return was practical under rising water conditions. Once committed, their options narrowed gradually until none remained that could be executed safely. The report avoids the word mistake. It uses delay. Opportunities for withdrawal existed earlier in the day, the document states. These opportunities diminished progressively. No evidence suggests awareness of finality at the time of passage. Hindsight dominates the language of those left behind. Moore's wife wrote years later that she replayed the morning endlessly, searching for something she might have said. "If I had asked him to stay," she wrote, "perhaps he would have." The statement assumes that choice was still open when words mattered. Klein's brother fixated on logistics. He examined maps, marking potential exit points in pencil. "Here," he wrote beside one, "and here." The annotations create a sense of clarity that did not exist at the time. Bell's parents focused on the notebook. They believed that if he had written one more sentence, it might have explained everything. They did not consider that explanation might not have been available even to him. Reed carried the heaviest burden. Though he did not accompany the men that day, having been assigned another ferry route earlier in the season, his expertise placed him at the center of retrospective blame. He was asked repeatedly why he had not warned them more forcefully about the river. His answers did not change. "There was nothing to warn about," he said. "Not then." The historian reviewing these testimonies must note how hindsight reshapes expectation. What later appears obvious rarely was. The tragedy, reconstructed carefully, contains no sharp edges. It unfolds as a narrowing corridor, entered willingly because it did not yet appear narrow. The aftermath is filled with statements that begin with if they had stopped earlier, if they had turned back at the first landing, if they had camped, if they had waited. Each if implies a moment of clarity that never arrived. The river did not rush them. It did not surprise them. It simply continued, indifferent to timing. The investigation concluded quietly. No official cause was listed beyond presumed accidental disappearance. The file was closed. The underline in the weather ledger remained. Nothing dramatic was added to the record. No warning was issued. No procedures were revised. Life in Glenrowan resumed its rhythm. Only the absence remained. In the end, the historical record resists climax. There is no document that captures the final hour. No testimony describing fear. No physical trace that can be pointed to as the moment when survival became impossible. What remains is a narrowing of probabilities traced backward through paper, memory, and assumption. This absence of drama is itself the conclusion. The disappearance of Moore, Klein, Bell, and the unnamed river between them does not hinge on a single error or a sudden misjudgment. It rests instead on a shared confidence that time would continue to behave as it always had, that it would remain elastic, that it would allow for correction when correction became necessary. The men did not ignore danger. They postponed acknowledging it. The historian, returning to the archives decades later, finds this pattern repeated across many cases that never become legends. The illusion of time is rarely violent. It is courteous. It waits patiently for people to finish what they are doing. It does not interrupt. It does not insist. In the margin of Bell's notebook, on a page preceding the final entry, there is a small correction where he erased a line and rewrote it more neatly. That detail, trivial on its own, suggests a mind still operating within ordinary parameters. A mind unconcerned with urgency. Moore's letters, reread without irony, reveal a man who trusted sequence. First the work, then the return. He did not imagine a break between those stages, because his experience had never required him to. Klein's ledgers end cleanly. No frantic notes, no unsettled accounts. Everything assumes continuation. The river, for its part, made no exception. It did what rivers do. It rose gradually. It narrowed options incrementally. It did not distinguish between caution and confidence. The illusion lay not in believing the river was safe, but in believing that safety would announce its absence clearly. What these men encountered was not danger, but delay, the slow erosion of choice beneath the appearance of continuity. By the time choice demanded attention, attention was already elsewhere, occupied by routine adjustments and unspoken trust. This is why the tragedy feels almost polite. No one shouted, no one rushed, no one violated their role. Each man behaved as he was expected to behave, and in doing so, each reinforced the assumption that there would be time to behave differently later. Later never arrived as a moment. It arrived as absence. The historian is tempted, as all historians are, to impose lesson and warning. Yet the documents resist moralization. They show no arrogance, no bravado, no defiance of known limits. They show patience. Patience, unmoored from re-evaluation, becomes indistinguishable from neglect. The final report concludes with a sentence that seems inadequate until it is read carefully. No extraordinary circumstances were observed. That sentence is not an oversight. It is the point. Nothing extraordinary occurred. The men were not overtaken by chaos. They were overtaken by continuation. They could have stopped. They could have turned back. They could have acted earlier without consequence. They chose not to, not out of stubbornness, but out of trust in time's generosity. And time on that day was less generous than it appeared. That is all the record can say.